Strawberry Mountain is one of the highest peaks in eastern Oregon, and we're going to do a little tour of the forest ecology of the area today. Here's the route up the mountain. Starts off climbing through a remarkably diverse forest, a nice mature subalpine forest for this environment. There's a few old snags left from the last fire, and there's mixed dominance between grand fir white fir hybrids, as is typical in this part of Oregon, and Douglas fir and western larch and Engelmann spruce, and a little bit of subalpine fir, which will probably get a lot more abundant as I go up, fair bit of lodgepole pine, and occasional western white pine. The understory of this diverse forest mostly consists of species that would be familiar to somebody in the eastern Cascades. We have Pexistum emersonites, and a small-leaved huckleberry, might be the grouse whortleberry. Also a larger-leaved huckleberry, Vaccinium membranaceum, and occasional understory herbs or shrubs, I guess you would technically call them, like Camophila umbellata and Linnea borealis, the twin flower, and Arctostaphylos uva ursi, the bearberry, as well as regeneration of essentially all the species present in the canopy, particularly the shade-tolerant ones such as Engelmann spruce and grand fir. The lake appears to have been a glacial cirque, a pretty large valley glacier, a couple kilometers across. Steep cirque walls still there on all sides. Volcanic rock, fairly old volcanic rock as I recall from my geology. Mostly a western larch forest at this point, subalpine. This late in the year the lake is quite low. We see here, I'm standing at the outlet, a lot of wood that's stranded during lake overflow events at this outlet where things converge, and flows down through meadow that is now fairly dry. At this point I'm on an overlook on a ridgetop way above Strawberry Lake, which is visible there in the distance, and beyond it the lowland valley of the John Day River. The forest up here has Douglas fir, which is that prominent tree sticking up into the skyline. Quite a bit of Douglas fir, fair bit of lodgepole pine, probably the second most dominant up here. Also subalpine fir and a five-needle pine. I think this is mostly a whitebark pine area. This is a dense tree clump of lodgepole pine, cumulatively adding up to a pretty large crowned individual. But it's interesting how many stems have fused to form this tree. At least 3, 4. Possibly originated from a seed cache or just a group of seedlings that grew close together. Genetic testing would be interesting because it would reveal how closely related these were, which in turn might indicate whether they originated from the same cone. And these are a couple of whitebark pine cones cut and partially gleaned by a squirrel. You can see he did not finish the job. If it had been a bird, like a Clark's nutcracker, it would have done a much more thorough job, and each one of these scales would have been pried back so that the bird's bill could get in there and retrieve the seed. I'm standing on the foot of a talus of volcanic rocks. I believe very old volcanic rocks. These mountains have Paleozoic island arc volcanics in them that are some of the oldest rocks known in Oregon. Up there is the summit of the mountain. We're getting close to timberline here. The forest at this point is primarily composed of lodgepole pine with substantial amounts of subalpine fir and whitebark pine mixed in throughout. A lot of the trees are young. There's a fair bit of mortality from various causes. The whitebark pine mostly from blister rust. The other trees Primarily it seems from defoliators. There hasn't been much evidence of fire in this area for quite some time. Little scenic vista from 8,200 feet on Strawberry Mountain. We have a ridge here leading up to the summit. You can see quite a few snags on it. They're nearly all older whitebark pines that were killed when the blister rust first arrived in this area. It's well established here. I've seen lots of ribes in the understory. There's a timberline visible on the mountain. Most of those tree clumps up there leading up to the timberline are probably going to turn out to be subalpine fir. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some Engelmann spruce up there as well. Apart from that, it's mostly barren talus and loose sediment. This is the forest the trail just came up through. Lodgepole pine, whitebark pine, subalpine fir. Distinctive crowns visible at this distance. Western juniper here in the ridge crest at the base of a whitebark pine snag. This is a girl. That is to say, it has female cones on it. Go in. Take a little closer look at those. They are not quite ripe yet. They'll be bluish once they've ripened up fully. But those are the cones. Looking over the south side of the ridge, we have a very different vista. The valley in the distance holds the small town of Seneca. A lot of the country between here and there shows signs of recent burns. These are 20th century burns, high severity, that killed all the trees over fairly large areas. Slopes on this side are more gentle, so there's a lot of foreground material here. Same species that we saw before, whitebark pine snags dominating the view here. Also, subalpine fir. Here's one with an exceptionally vigorous cone crop on it. Right in front of me here is a whitebark pine snag that has evidence of extensive burl formation on the upper part of the tree, possibly caused by an adelgid of some kind. And although the tree itself shows right here some evidence of an old fire, and it's also lying on top of a snag of a previous whitebark pine that shows char, indicating probably that it was either killed by that large fire or more likely was already dead down on the ground, possibly, at the time the fire occurred. Similarly, we have an older snag here. It's been hollowed out by fire. So there's a complex disturbance here, history here, of a fire that occurred perhaps a century ago, followed by regeneration of a whitebark pine dominated forest, followed by the invasion of white pine blister rust, which killed nearly all of those whitebark pines. And the regeneration cohort includes a lot of subalpine fir, which may have been present earlier as well, but subalpine fir tends to burn up in fires and it doesn't last long due to its rapid decay after it comes down. There's still a lot of live whitebark pine up here, including some big trees. As I mentioned, there's ribes here. There is blister rust. Most of these trees have evidence of blister rust, but they're resistant, or for some other reason, the blister rust is not as virulent up here as it is at lower elevations, possibly due to the severity of the climate. And the whole ridgetop, basically a patchwork of living and dead whitebark pines. Note the multi-stem character on these snags, indicating that they probably grew from seed caches containing multiple seeds. Therefore, genetically distinct individuals, although often related. This is the trail junction with the Onion Creek Trail, about 8,400 feet. At this point, it seems to have changed to a high-severity fire. All of the whitebarks in this area died. Some of the snags have char on them, indicating that they were probably already dead, or at least that those stems were dead at the time of the fire. Most do not, which suggests that they were killed by the fire. although doubtless some of them were also blister rust mortality. There's very little regeneration, which may indicate that the site is not especially suitable for regeneration given the climate conditions that have obtained since the fire. Or it may indicate that for some other reason the nutcrackers have not been caching seeds here and instead have moved farther down the ridge to the last area I was shooting photos. Now we are up to that area of timberline trees that we saw from down below. And as I thought, they primarily are subalpine fir, which is what we see here. And then off there on the right side of the picture in the distance, there's also some whitebark pine. Now, talk a little bit about where we are here. This is a southwest facing slope, very exposed. And we're at about 8,500 feet elevation. The primary storms in this part of the world come from that direction, due southwest over that pass there. And it's cold and snowy, with temperatures far below freezing throughout all of the winter months. And although a lot of snow and ice blows through here, very little of it accumulates because there's no place for it to hold. These tree clumps capture as much of that snow and ice as they can, and they become encased in it, and it protects the foliage from the effects of wind-blown ice. And that's one reason why they can live up here. But parts of the trees are exposed and are really not very well protected. And in those areas, any exposed foliage can be killed. And if the winds are high enough, and if enough wind-blown ice crystals are carried, the bark itself can be killed. So this is an area of exposed bark on this fir. There used to be live foliage here, but it's been killed. The bark is still alive. You can see a few yellowish dead needles located along this tree. These are areas where the foliage probably was exposed for at least part of the winter, and the wind-blown snow and ice caused erosion of the waxy cuticle, and the needles have subsequently lost a lot of their water regulation ability, and they're dying of drought stress, basically. And that death by drought stress on exposed points is the main thing that gives these tree clumps their distinctive shape. We can see that this particular tree clump is bearing cones this year, and often these clumps are growing at such high elevation that they're incapable of either producing cones or at least of producing fertile cones. But this is a relatively low elevation for subalpine fir at about 8,500 feet. And so there's a good chance that these are actually viable cones and will open and produce viable seed later on this fall. This is the lee, that is to say the downwind side of that same subalpine fir clump, and we see that it has some snags in it. And this is something we often see in tree clumps because exceptionally deep and persistent accumulations of snow can form in these downwind portions of the tree clump, enough that it appreciably shortens the growing season and allows the tree to succumb to other stresses like snow fungus that are associated with a shortened growing season and reduced photosynthetic ability. Now right next to that clump we have another clump that's made of whitebark pine. And of course whitebark pine means that it was planted here. Some nutcracker or gray jay or maybe even a crow flew up here and stuck some seeds in this little patch of south-facing slope where there was a bit of exposed soil. You can see there's some herb and shrub growth in this area due to how close the exposed soil is to the surface. And as with the subalpine fir clump, we see that there's a bit of a skirt around the base of this clump where the snow would accumulate and the foliage would be relatively protected. And we see that there are exposed areas of bark where the tree was unprotected and the live foliage was killed. And we see areas of dying needles that are probably related to the fact that last winter, was an exceptionally dry winter, the beginning of the drought that we're currently experiencing, which is the most severe drought ever recorded in eastern Oregon, at least the most severe one-year drought. It remains to be seen if it will last on into the future. But due to this drought severity, there was a relatively low snowpack, and so not as much snow accumulated around this tree as would in a normal winter, and that meant that some foliage was exposed and was killed by exposure to the wind over the course of the winter. Well, this is the summit of Strawberry. There might even be a register in there somewhere. That is the ridge with the whitebark pines that we walked up earlier. And this is the view off to the south from the mountaintop. Extensive burned areas on both sides of the crest, running west from here and down toward the valley of Seneca in the distance. Looking due west on the crest from here, the highest peaks are about 1,500 or 2,000 feet lower than here. Then, in the distance there, we've got the town of John Day and the valley of the John Day River. Fair bit of irrigation down there. That's just part of the summit. More of the John Day River Valley and the town of Prairie City. And the John Day continuing off in the distance. Now that's Strawberry Creek running down into the foreground, and next to it is the road that leads into the trailhead, while Highway 26 continues on the John Day Valley in the background until somewhere around here, probably here, where it breaks off and heads up into the mountains and crosses over towards Sumter and Baker City. In the foreground, we have the Strawberry Massif itself and a fairly extensive north side forest that has so far eluded the effects of fire.